The first gunshot tore through the lobby of St. Augustine Medical Center, before the morning coffee had even finished brewing in the breaker room. Nurse Teresa Calloway was halfway through a chart update at the nurse's station. A coffee stain already drying on the cuff of her scrubs when the sound hit. Not a bang, a crack, flat, sharp, controlled. The kind of sound that didn't echo so much as cut straight through the air and disappear. Her pen stopped moving mid-signature. Everyone else in the corridor reacted a half-second later. A janitor dropped his mop. A young resident physician froze mid-step with a tablet in his hand. But Teresa's body had already done something different, something quieter. She didn't gasp, she didn't duck. She lifted her head, slow and deliberate, toward the sound. The way a person turns a familiar voice in a crowded room. That stillness, that absence of panic in a moment, built for panic, was the first sign that something underneath Teresa Calloway didn't match the badge clipped to her scrubs. His name was Dennis Hargrove. 31 years old, 6'1". A man who'd spent the last 18 months sliding from bad decisions into worse ones, and who now stood at the entrance of the emergency department with a stolen 9mm pistol and a face slick with sweat under the hospital's fluorescent lights. He'd come for the locked medication cabinet in the back pharmacy. Specifically the controlled substances that could be flipped for cash, fast enough to satisfy a debt that had stopped being negotiable 2 weeks ago. He had a plan. The plan had 3 parts. Get in, get the drugs, get out before anyone called it in seriously. The plan fell apart in the first 90 seconds, though Hargrove wouldn't understand why for several more minutes. He grabbed the nearest person standing still. And that person happened to be Teresa. Closest to the desk, badge swinging. Dark blonde hair coming loose from its clip. He yanked her backward by the shoulder and pressed the muzzle of the gun against her temple. Before she'd even finished turning around, he chose her because she was close. Because she looked like exactly what her ID badge said. A nurse, mid-30s, unremarkable, harmless. He had no idea what he'd actually grabbed. "Nobody move," Hargrove shouted, his voice cracking on the second word. "Nobody touches a phone, nobody calls anybody or she's done." The waiting room emptied of motion instantly. A mother pulled her son down behind a row of chairs. An elderly man in a wheelchair sat, frozen hands gripping the armrests. Somewhere behind the front desk, a receptionist's hand hovered over a phone, and then retreated slow, like she was disarming a trap. The overhead PA system gave one drastic click, as if someone in the back office had reached for the intercom and then thought better of it. Hargrove didn't care about any of that. He cared about one door, the one leading back to the pharmacy storage room, and one woman standing between him and it, currently serving as his shield. What he couldn't see, what nobody at St. Augustine had ever had reason to ask about, was the 6 years Teresa Calloway had spent as a combat nurse attached to a forward surgical team, the kind that moved with units nobody back home ever heard mentioned by name. 3 rotations, 2 of them in places that didn't appear on the news, because acknowledging them caused more problems than it solved. She had pulled men out of vehicles that were still on fire. She had run field triage under a kind of pressure most emergency room nurses train for in theory and never actually meet. She had, more than once, had a weapon pointed somewhere near her. And she had learned, not through bravado, not through luck, but through hundreds of repetitions, exactly what her body needed to do when that happened. Drop the heart rate. Slow the breath. Watch everything. So while Hargrove dragged her backward toward the pharmacy corridor, snapping at the staff to stay down, Teresa was doing something else entirely. She was cataloging. The grip on her left shoulder, fingers digging in but trembling slightly. Adrenaline, not training. The gun in his right hand, wrist not locked, barrel drifting half an inch with every breath he took. His weight rocking back onto his heels, the stance of a man who had never actually practiced. Holding a hostage and a weapon at the same time. The distance between her elbow and his ribs, close enough to matter if it came to that. The pressure of the muzzle against her skull, firm, present but not fixed. It would move before it fired if she gave it a reason to move. She filed it all away the way she'd once filed away the position of an IED marker or the sound of an engine that didn't belong in a convoy. Quietly, completely, without her face changing at all. What Hargrove saw was a nurse, scrubs, a stethoscope looped loose around her neck, an ID badge that read Calloway T. Arn. A woman who, by every reasonable expectation a desperate man could form in a hospital lobby, should have been shaking. Should have been crying, should have been begging. What he didn't see What nobody at this hospital had ever needed to see was a deployment record sealed under a classification most administrative staff didn't know existed. He didn't see the trauma certifications earned in tents lit by generator power instead of fluorescent tubes. He didn't see the part of her training that had nothing to do with medicine at all. The close quarters instruction folded quietly into her unit's pre-deployment workups, taught by men who assumed correctly that medics sometimes ended up closer to the fighting than anyone planned for. It wasn't a costume she was wearing, it was simply underneath. "Everyone stay down," Teresa said, her voice low and even, directed at the room rather than at the man holding her. "Stay calm." Nobody moved toward the doors. Hargrove hesitated. Barely, a half-second flicker, confused by the steadiness in a voice that should have been trembling. That half-second was enough. In it, Teresa's right hand, hanging loose at her side, drifted to the edge of the trauma shears clipped to her waistband. She didn't draw them, she located them, made contact, filed the position away the way she'd filed everything else. "Shut up," Hargrove snapped, jerking the gun tighter against her skull. "You walk, you don't talk." "Okay," she said. "I'll walk." And she did, straight toward the pharmacy corridor, exactly where he wanted her. Because somewhere in the last 60 seconds she had already decided that the back hallway, narrow equipment-lined, with exactly one entrance and one exit, was where this was going to end. He thought he was pulling her into his plan. She was walking him into hers. She could feel his pulse hammering through the forearm wrapped across her collarbone. Too fast, too erratic, the rhythm of a man being run by fear rather than running it. She'd felt that exact rhythm before on other men, in other hallways that smelled like diesel instead of antiseptic, and she knew with quiet certainty how it usually ended. Behind them, a young nurse named Lily Marsh pressed herself flat against the supply cart and watched Teresa being dragged past, unable to look away. What stopped Lily's breath wasn't fear on Teresa's face. It was the absence of it. Her jaw was set. Her eyes moved steadily, methodically, across the room, across Hargrove's hands, across the door ahead. Cataloging, not pleading. And just before the corridor door swung shut between them, Lily could have sworn she saw something cross Teresa's expression that had nothing to do with terror at all. Something closer to focus. The pharmacy corridor door sealed with a soft hydraulic hiss, and for one suspended moment, it was just the two of them. Teresa, Hargrove, the hum of refrigeration units holding insulin at the correct temperature, and a silence that usually smelled like rubbing alcohol and routine. Today it smelled like that, and something else underneath it. Gunpowder. Fear sweet. And something Hargrove had no name, for the particular settled stillness of a woman who had already decided how the next 90 seconds were going to go. He shoved her forward hard toward the center of the narrow hall. She let herself stumble, a controlled stumble, deliberate, the kind designed to make a frightened man feel like he was the one in charge, and caught herself against a supply shelf. Her hand brushed a tray of instruments on the way down, forceps, a scalpel still in its sterile sleeve, suture scissors. She didn't take any of it, not yet. A man who was talking was a man who was thinking, and a thinking man, in her experience, eventually made a mistake. "Where's the cabinet?" Hargrove demanded, breath ragged. "Through there, past the cold storage room." Teresa turned to face him, fully, hands raised, slow and visible, positioning herself so the corridor's single overhead light fell behind her and directly onto his face. A small thing. A trick that worked the same way in a hospital hallway as it had once worked in a tent at 0300. Make his pupils contract, blur the edges of his focus, just enough to slow him down without him ever understanding why. "Move then," he said. "I'll take you there," she said. "But you need to know something first." He laughed, short and humorless. "I don't need to know anything from you." "There are 2 security officers stationed past the cold room," Teresa said, her voice never rising, never wavering. "One of them used to be a state trooper. If you walk me through there with that gun out, they will not negotiate with you. They will not hesitate." She paused, let it land. "But if you let me walk ahead of you and tell them you're a patient, psychiatric hold, agitated, no visible weapon, we can get past them without anyone getting hurt. I'm trying to get you out of this building alive." It was a complete fabrication. There was no trooper. There was a maintenance technician named Walt and a part-time security guard, who carried a flashlight and a radio and nothing else. But Hargrove didn't know that, and for the first time since he'd walked through the front doors of St. Augustine, the thing crossing his face wasn't aggression. It was doubt. The gun dropped 2 inches. Not far. Far enough. Why would you help me? He asked, and there was something almost young in the way he said it. Because I want everyone in this building to go home tonight, Teresa said. That includes you. She took one slow step toward him, hands still raised, still visible. You're not a killer, mister. She let the silence ask the question. Hargrove, he said before he could stop himself. Mr. Hargrove, if you were a killer, there'd already be a body on this floor. You're a man who owes the wrong people money, and you ran out of time. I've seen that exact look on a face before. I know exactly what it means. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not softening, not quite, but something closer to being seen for the first time in longer than he could remember. Hostage takers rarely expect to be understood. When it happens, it opens a gap. A small one. A momentary one. Teresa had spent 6 years learning exactly how to live inside gaps that small. The trauma shears came free in a single motion. No telegraph, no hesitation. Drawn up and across in a short, brutal arc that caught the inside of his gun arm at the wrist. The blunt edge struck the nerve cluster there, with enough force to send a white-hot signal up through his elbow, and his fingers convulsed open before his brain had finished registering pain. The pistol dipped. Teresa's left hand was already moving, closing over the barrel, twisting outward and down. In a motion her body had performed so many hundreds of times in training that it no longer required thought. And she stepped into him at the same instant, driving her shoulder into his sternum, using his own backward stumble to strip the weapon fully from his grip. 4 seconds, maybe 5. Hargrove hit the wall beside the cold storage door. Teresa stepped back, the pistol now in her hand, muzzle angled down, her breathing completely unchanged. She could have leveled it at him. She set it on a steel shelf behind her instead, out of his reach, and put her body between him and the only exit. Sit down, she said. He stared at her, cradling his wrist against his chest, his face draining to a color she recognized. The particular shade a person turns when their entire understanding of a situation has just been rebuilt from the ground up in under 5 seconds. Sit down, she said again, quieter this time. You're not hurt. I could have broken that wrist and I didn't. Sit. He sat, sliding down the wall onto an overturned supply crate, because there was nothing left in him to do otherwise. Teresa crossed to the wall phone mounted near the cold storage door and dialed security with 4 words. Pharmacy corridor. Come now. Then she turned back to Hargrove, leaned against the steel shelving, and looked at him the way she'd once looked at frightened, broken men in places far from any hospital. Not with contempt, not with triumph, but with something closer to exhaustion. The kind that doesn't come from the fight itself, but from years of staying ready for it. When the security guard and the maintenance technician arrived, less than a minute later, they found Dennis Hargrove sitting on a crate with his head down, and his wrist throbbing, unarmed. And Teresa Calloway, standing a few feet away, already filling out an incident note on a clipboard, because the next shift wasn't going to chart itself. Are you okay? The guard asked, staring at the pistol sitting on the shelf, then at Teresa, then back at the pistol. He'll need that wrist looked at before anyone takes him anywhere, Teresa said, capping her pen. Mild contusion, no fracture I can feel. Everyone else in the building is fine. She glanced toward the door. I'd like to get back to my patients now. She walked past him, back through the corridor doors and into the fluorescent hum of the emergency department, where a resident physician was still standing, frozen near the front desk, and the receptionist's hands were shaking on the phone she'd finally been allowed to pick up. Teresa didn't stop to explain. She picked her clipboard back up from where she'd left it on the counter, glanced at the next name on her list, and got back to work, because that was the part of her nobody at St. Augustine had ever had reason to understand. Not the attending physicians who occasionally talked over her in rounds. Not the scheduling office that moved her around the floor like she was interchangeable. Not the new residents who saw a calm, competent, slightly tired-looking nurse in her mid-30s and nothing more. They saw a nurse, capable, reliable, unremarkable in the way the best ones often are. They had no idea what she'd carried out of 3 deployments, and folded quietly into the rest of her life. And as far as Teresa Calloway was concerned, that was exactly how it was going to stay.